Hey team, welcome back to another episode of the Strength Game Podcast. I'm your host, Nick O'Brien, and this is episode number 131. The Strength Game is a weekly podcast dedicated to discussing all things physical culture, with the coaches, athletes, iron enthusiasts, and experts deeply embedded in the strength game on both sides of the profession, both as coaches and as competitive athletes. I want to thank everyone who has liked, shared, commented, has rated the show, has left us feedback and given us support for future guests and more. All that support allows us to continue to bring on expert guests and highlight more individuals in the strength game, just like our guests today. Also want to take this time to thank our sponsors. Samson Equipment has been providing uncompromising quality for over 40 years. Samson products are long-lasting and made of the highest quality equipment on the market. Each project is built from the ground up with the ability to customize every need. The team at Samson focuses on developing the highest quality relationships with their customers, in addition to providing them unparalleled quality in every piece of equipment bearing the Samson name. Learn more about Samson's professional weight room solutions and the Samson standard at samsonequipment.com. Also want to thank our sponsor, Cerberus Strength. Cerberus is an organization that truly puts the athlete first and actively works towards providing the best quality gear at an affordable price. Owned and operated by active lifters, Cerberus has quickly evolved into a global brand symbolizing quality and trust. If you're in the market for the highest quality strength and conditioning gear and equipment, be sure to check out CerberusStrength.com and use promo code STRENGTH_game to receive an extra 10% off your next order. Also want to thank our sponsor, Sport Kilt. Born in Scotland and stitched in America, Sport Kilt offers the highest quality custom kilts and accessories. Sport Kilt products are made for people who like to be active and make a statement while they train, compete, play, and adventure. Their kilts are designed for comfort, freedom, and style, made for all the brave ways you move. Check out the No Pants All Glory selection and shop the best collection of high quality American-made sport kilts and accessories at sportkilt.com and use promo code TSG to receive an extra 10% off your next order. And in this week's episode, I am joined by Madison Peele. Madison is an assistant sports performance coach at the University of Southern California. Peele joined the Trojans in 2022, where she works with the beach volleyball, women's tennis, women's water polo, women's cross country, and men's cross country programs. Peele arrived at USC after completing a graduate assistant position at Florida State University. She first began as a student intern coach in 2020, and before being promoted to a graduate assistant strength conditioning coach working with the Olympic sports. During her time at FSU, she was also heavily involved on the sports science side of performance, serving as a graduate research assistant for 1 year, in addition to working as a tactical strength coach with the Florida State's ROTC program and Bravo Company Cadets. She started a career as a student volunteer at East Carolina in 2019, and from there, interned as a tactical strength coach at Fort Bragg, assisting with the training for combat engineers, intelligence, combat sport, and the 1-7 Air Defense Artillery soldiers. Peele is active herself in and out of the weight room. She lifts 3 to 4 times a week, trying out new exercise methods, programs, and runs 5 to 6 times a week, trying to accomplish whatever challenge or goals she has set for herself while balancing the rigors of the difficult college coaching schedule. She's an avid lifter and enjoys painting, surfing, and hanging out with her 2 dogs when she is not training in the weight room. Like I said, I'm excited to have her on the show today. So, with all that said, let's get in the game with Coach Madison Peele. What's going on, everybody? Today we're going coast to coast again. I've got Coach Madison Peele on the show from kind of my old area out in California, but the nice area up in LA a little bit. So, how you doing today, Coach?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to talk to you. Kind of got I don't think we really got to talk much last year at national championship for beach volleyball. Everybody was like kind of sporadic. It was my first time there with our team. So, and I know you guys were busy and everything too. And we'll talk about like the success of the program and everything. And I want to kind of pick your brain a little bit on that stuff as well. But before we get into any coaching, any stuff like that, I really want to kind of get started into what kind of got you going into training, lifting, kind of being active. Like what kind of started that for you leading into like this active lifestyle and then ultimately coaching?
Yeah, so growing up, I always just loved trying different sports and doing new things. So pretty much anything that crossed my path, I told my parents like, "Hey, I want to do that. I want to try that," and they would support it and let me do it. So I did everything from dance, cheerleading to football and wrestling, and then everything in between. But I always ran, and I was always a pretty decent runner. So when I got to high school, my main sports were track, cross country, and then I would swim during indoor track season as like a little bit of cross training to give me a break from cross country going into outdoor track season. But I didn't really know anything about the weight room. I had a friend, his name was Jeremy White, and he loved weightlifting, powerlifting, all that kind of stuff. And he would go to the gym in town all the time, and he invited me to go one day. I was like, okay, cool. So I started training with him, and that was my first time ever lifting. It was probably my sophomore year of high school, maybe. But I really liked it, and my sports were getting better and better. My athletic performance on the track as well as in the water. And I didn't really know the connection between the two. Still didn't really know much about strength and conditioning when I got to college. So I didn't really get to experience the training the athlete side of things until like my junior year of college. But yeah, first intro was Jeremy White in high school.
That's pretty cool. That's a pretty eclectic group of sports too, like to kind of be involved in. I know you kind of touched on it too. Was running kind of the main focus and everything else was just kind of building towards that? Like, was there a specific event in track or anything that kind of like was really like took your heart that you that was the main focus, or was it a little bit of everything?
I was always good at distance running, so not the fun stuff. So just going for a really long time in a lot of circles. I was always just a good distance runner. So when I would go to outdoor track season, my main event was the 2 mile, but I loved to try new stuff. So by the time I got to my senior year, my events were triple jump, pole vault, the 300 hurdles, and the 2 mile. So kind of a little bit of everything, but again, my main event was the 2 mile.
Yeah, those are kind of interesting compliments to your favorite event being the 2 mile. But I mean, there's decathletes and heptathletes out there, so you kind of have to be able to balance all those things. So, like from that time, kind of learning like what the weight room was, and then coaching, and maybe that aspect of it. Was there anything from that time that really kind of sparked your interest in coaching, or did that come later with someone else, or was it just kind of within the process of training that you fell into that?
So I didn't even go to college with the intent to be a strength coach. Initially, I wanted to be a veterinarian. So when I started at East Carolina University, it was to in school to be a clinical lab science. And around my sophomore year, I had a friend who was in the health fitness specialist major, and she was kind of telling me what her major did and what the purpose was and what they kind of their jobs were. And I was like, oh, you get to work out and train people? Like that sounds really cool. Way better than sitting in a lab all day. So I ended up switching my major from clinical lab science to health fitness. And that was when I kind of got the exposure of personal training, corporate wellness, group fitness, cardiac rehab, all that kind of stuff, which was cool. But again, I still didn't really know about strength and conditioning. And that came when we had guest speakers come to class. And it was a new avenue I hadn't looked at yet. And I took a little gander and really liked it. So I kind of just took it down a little rabbit hole.
Yeah, you basically took a full 180. You had the option during health fitness to kind of go more like maybe a cardiorespiratory like or maybe a different kind of health and fitness route that is probably still semi lab based, but you're dealing with usually two leg animals versus four leg ones. So it's still a big kind of twist. So like from that experience, I'm sure you're kind of like nowadays, a lot of people are almost playing catch up by the time you get to like sophomore and junior year of college. Like a lot of people are declaring that as their major like right away. Did it feel like at any point in time like you were playing catch up or like you were just taking all that information quick, or was it kind of like a slow burn to just understand what the fitness side of what the coaching side was because you already kind of had a lot of experience as an athlete?
So, it wasn't until my senior year I even started interning. So I would say from the development side of just the X's and O's of being a strength coach, that's where I was playing catch up because I didn't know about it. And I didn't get the opportunity to know about it until my senior year when the one of the strength coaches came to speak to our class. And I found it interesting. So I asked if I could start interning at East Carolina with their staff, and they let me intern. And that was what kind of solidified I wanted to do that instead of the personal training, group fitness, all that kind of stuff. Because I had had experiences doing it and it was fun, but it wasn't what I wanted to do. And then getting into the internship at East Carolina, I was like, okay, this is more along the lines of what I want to do because I had an idea in my head of what I wanted. I just didn't know what it was yet. So I would say I was definitely playing catch up in that sense of terms of the development process of being an intern, learning the X's and O's, how things run in a session, things like that. But I kind of just tried to soak it all up and learn quick, think on my feet, and jump from position to position to take as much in as I could wherever I was at.
Yeah, that's you kind of that first internship experience, especially like in the college sector where everything's so fast. A lot of times there's not a lot of time to kind of sit down and really just understand. You're just going team to team or you're kind of getting passed off to a different coach or everything. And it's nice in a way. Like I was thinking about it, like walking back from one of my groups today. I was like, man, it must be so nice to be an intern because you don't have to program, you don't have to do anything, you don't have to go to meetings. You just get to coach and kind of learn as you go. And I was like, I miss that because I don't want to go to this next meeting at all. But that it's awesome to kind of get that first experience because it kind of really solidifies for a lot of people whether or not this is where you want to go. And then as soon as you find that out, you're just kind of going everywhere. But if correct me if I'm wrong, from there though, you started interning at Fort Bragg or Fort Liberty, but back to Fort Bragg again, which is awesome. So is that what happened? Like it's not too far of a shift away from ECU, like location wise. Is that
Uh,
kind of what the next step was?
no, I actually went down to Florida State after East Carolina
Oh,
and then
okay.
to Fort Bragg. Because to graduate from my major, you had to do an internship somewhere. And I had done a semester at East Carolina. So I was like, okay, I want to go somewhere else, learn from other coaches, experience new teams. I applied to schools all over the place and mainly on the East Coast. But I applied to Florida State. And I ended up getting a call and they're like, hey, we've accepted you for our intern position. Are you interested in accepting it? I was like, yeah. So I canceled all of my other interviews. I was like, all right, I got one. Like, we're good. We're taking it. And I knew a little bit about Florida State, but not a ton, just because I was from North Carolina. I'd never really traveled down south a ton other than vacation. So going into it, they had a couple of sports that were different from East Carolina, which was a huge intriguing factor that excited me, like beach volleyball and some sports like that. But it was after I finished up that internship, I went back to North Carolina. That was the summer of COVID that I'm sure everyone loved. And there wasn't really any internship opportunities. So I went back to teaching surf lessons and just would look on different websites to see where coaches were at, what their paths had been, and then reach out to them for just different calls to ask them how they got to where they were. And there was a coach named Molly at Fort Bragg. She worked for Reef Systems. I'm sure the name has changed now. But she was a coach at UNC working with track and then went tactical. And I think that would be a really cool avenue to go eventually. So I reached out to her and essentially was like, hey, like you're in a position that I want to be in one day. How did you get there? And she kind of talked to me about her path. And then from that conversation, she's like, by the way, we're trying to start an internship program. Would you be interested in doing it this summer? I was like, yeah. So I accepted that internship. I was kind of their guinea pig, which was cool. I didn't really do a ton of the intern ed because I had finished that at Florida State. So I just kind of went straight into the Flames, got there day one. They said day two, you're leading a workout. I was like, sounds good. So it was a lot of learning on the fly. I worked with multiple different units there, which was a really cool experience. There wasn't a ton of equipment or access to resources. So having to be creative and think on your feet was a really cool experience as well.
Yeah, there's some units definitely that have a little bit of nothing, and there's some that have some of all the shiny toys, but it's definitely a different type of environment, different type of kind of athlete per se that you're working with and training for different goals versus an actual athlete like training for sports. So it's cool to kind of get the contrast of different experience like early on too. And then even at an internship level, like that's one thing I wish that I was able to do, even though like I did so many internships and learning from different coaches, you're still kind of in the same setting. Like you were able to do that going from ECU like to Florida State and actually see other teams. And that was like one of the big goals for me too, like as an intern to go out and see sports that my school didn't necessarily offer and then go somewhere else. So that's definitely a great experience and always like something you can kind of keep in your back pocket for later if your kind of career aspirations change. But like inevitably you kind of went back to Florida State and you did a lot more there before you landed at USC. Like, so you worked with some of the cadets ROTC program at Florida State and research and strength conditioning. Like how did you kind of manage that blend of everything?
I'm a very organized individual, and it was not planned to go in and take on all those responsibilities. Originally, grad school wasn't even in the mind space for me because I finished my undergrad. I was like, I'm done with school. I don't want to do any more school. But then I found out to do this profession, you needed a master's degree. I was like, awesome. So I thought about just going back to East Carolina because my family has a house there and I was just going to live at home, save money. But the director at Florida State was really pushing me to apply to their master's program because it was a brand new program. It was sports science, which was kind of cool because it was you could learn everything that day and practically apply it that afternoon in your training sessions, which was a really unique opportunity. So I applied, got into grad school, went back down there. At the time, they were trying to make everything remote just because of the COVID precautions and everything. So classes were going to be online. My mom asked if I wanted to stay at home and do that. I said, no, I'm going to go down to Florida, essentially just show back up and ask if I could keep working. They'd already filled all their GA positions, and I went to the director and was like, hey, I'm back. Any chance I can still work and just intern or be a part of things? And she's like, I don't have any money for you. I was like, I don't care. I just want to work. So she gave me a team responsibility, and then from there things just kind of grew. So I started out with just one team responsibility, and it was men's cross country. And then I was still assisting with multiple sports, one being beach volleyball, another being women's soccer. And then from there, Florida State was involved with a couple different research studies, one of them being with Whoop. So I was able to kind of be involved with that and help give feedback on that process in terms of what the study was looking at. And then the ROTC stuff happened because the program director for the master's degree program I was in knew I wanted to work in the tactical sector eventually. And someone had reached out to her from ROTC asking if there was anybody in her program that she knew about who would be interested in volunteering and helping. She sent it to me, and I asked my director at the time if I could. She said, as long as you can still perform all of your responsibilities here with the Olympic staff, you can do it. I was like, okay, gotcha. So I would go in super early, train the cadets. I'd go to class. I'd come and work the teams with the Olympic staff. I would go to meetings with ROTC, come back, have meetings with our staff. So it was just a lot of back and forth and all over the place. But the organization and the communication was kind of key. But it was a really cool opportunity, and I learned a lot from it.
Yeah, that's definitely a cool experience. There's probably not a lot of people that have been able to do that, and a lot of schools don't offer it necessarily either, but to be able to kind of balance the two and again, kind of have your foot in both avenues and learn a little bit more and kind of apply the sports science and then also like do some tactical stuff and kind of get involved in meetings too. Like you definitely have to be organized to do all that stuff, but it's it's definitely beneficial too because it makes you a lot more well-rounded when you get to a position and you can kind of start honing in on smaller teams or do more with teams a lot more often. So definitely a big kind of change for you. So from there, then you kind of go on like and start working at USC and everything, and you are able to kind of like work with beach volleyball, and then you go from immediately from kind of a grad assistant position and kind of doing a little bit of everything to working with national championship caliber teams and then actually winning national championships with beach volleyball and being successful. Like, what was it kind of like being part of that, going from just kind of almost in the shadows in the background, just learning everything to immediately like, here's the most successful team for that sport on the planet right now.
Well, coming into the program, they don't talk about it a lot. So it doesn't really get talked about because every year the team approaches it as, well, it's a new year. It doesn't matter what we did last year. We have to start over and go again this year. So coming in, that was kind of the first thing I noticed was like no one talked about the back-to-back title. We just show up and we start working. Which was kind of cool and unique. That was something that I didn't really expect. I definitely was expecting it to be talked about a little bit more. But I was very fortunate during my time at Florida State to spend time with women's soccer, which was and is a very successful program. So being around a team that won national titles while I was there and it performs at a very high level, I had an understanding of how things are supposed to be done at that level. So it wasn't like I was coming in and I was blindsided by things. Having the experience with the Florida State soccer team, being able to be around the softball team there, and even the beach volleyball team at Florida State definitely kind of helped prime me for what I was going to take on here.
Yeah, you talk about it right there, like just handling success and like handling that high level. Like those are all very successful programs and pretty consistently like handling some of like that pressure that comes with being at the top and like really trying to work every year to sustain that. And that's really interesting to like hear that you guys don't even talk about like what happened the previous year and then to go back and repeat it too. Like that's a huge feat. So like from a strength coach's perspective though, like how do you kind of evaluate like the success of a year? Because like it's on paper, like you get a ring, like your team is raising the trophy at the end of the year, but like when it comes to being like the final team, like is objectively it just a successful year from the program if you win, or are you just kind of throwing that program away and starting scratch or kind of using it again the next year because it worked?
I don't like to use the same program every year, ever. I approach every year and every team as if I'm working with them for the very first time. So every year in the summer, as I'm going through things, not only am I evaluating what I did last year, as I go through my programs in Excel, I always have notes at the bottom of what I liked, what I didn't like, what worked well, what didn't work well. If something like didn't line up right in terms of our scheduling with fall competitions or the way practice was set up, whatever it was. I have a ton of notes at the bottom of my programs. So when it comes to the end of the year, I go back, I read, I reflect on those things. So I have a basic picture of what I liked, what I didn't like. And then when it comes to, sorry, my dogs are being rambunctious.
You're good, no problem.
Um, when it comes to putting together my annual plan and things like that, again, I approach it like I've never worked with a team before. So I'm going back through research and things like that, looking at key performance indicators, needs analysis, common injuries, because there's always new stuff being published. Recently, when I was going through tennis's stuff this past year, there was new catapult data released with specifically women's tennis players and how much load they're taking on during a match, which I thought was huge because there's a ton of stuff out on men, not a ton out on women, but it really helped me in terms of periodizing and progressing our conditioning plan for this year because I had concrete numbers to go off of, which was pretty cool. So every year I always approach things as if it's the first time. In terms of evaluating the success of the previous year, I don't think it's necessarily determined just if you won or not or on your standings. For me, if I'm looking at if I did a good job or not, I'm looking at were my kids able to compete at the highest level because I provided them with everything they needed. Did I create an impact of some sort, or was I able to develop positive relationships with my athletes and my coaches that help lead to this stability and foundation of trust and buy-in? That's kind of how I evaluate the success of the program. Not just the X's and O's, but were we able to build trust, build buy-in, educate, and compete at a very high level.
Yeah, that's a great way to kind of do it, to like actually sit down and evaluate it. Do you bring anybody else like into that conversation? Do you bounce ideas off of other staff members or other members of like that team as well too, to just kind of get more kind of outside influence or outside like perspective? Because it's hard sometimes when you sit there. And I think a lot of strength coaches are very critical of their program and of themselves as well, that it's kind of hard to like figure out sometimes what actually really worked well, what didn't work well, and then what you're focusing on is something that actually was super successful, but to an outside perspective, it's like, no, that's exactly what it should have been the whole time. You use anybody in the process when you're starting to kind of like look back on the season?
So I'll use women's tennis as an example because we meet a lot and we talk pretty regular about how things are going. So for women's tennis specifically, at the end of every semester, I will meet with the coaches and we will talk about what's working, what's not working, what do we want to focus on for the upcoming semester. They compete year round, so being able to have a couple more touch points on them is very, very helpful. And just closing that communication loop with my coaches is very helpful as well. When it comes to beach, I'm very fortunate. My coach just kind of like lets his hands off and lets me kind of do whatever I want to do, which is super cool. But it's also a lot of pressure of, am I doing the right thing or is it good? So for that team, a lot of my feedback comes from the girls. At the beginning and the end of every semester, we have player meetings. And from those meetings, I'm asking them, like personally, what are they working on? But also just in a team setting and what I'm giving them, what's working for you, what's not working for you, how can this be better? So at the end of the day, every single person is different and they need different things. So a lot of my feedback for beach volleyball comes from the girls. And then water polo is a new team that I'm working with. So I get a lot of feedback from the coaches, but I also get a lot of feedback from the girls as we're going through things, just to have an understanding of what they need and what is going to make them feel ready on game day or whatever it may be. Cross country is a fun one. They just got a new coach as well. So I'm constantly getting feedback from the coaches and then the males and the females in terms of what's working for them, what's not working. So it's a little bit different for every team, but I try to listen to as many voices as I can to get a bigger scope. And then it's not just me being in my head about things.
Yeah, that's a good way to kind of do it too. Obviously, getting more feedback and more influence from other people definitely kind of helps put the picture together and put it in perspective for you. It's filtering that information and trying to like ultimately like make a decision on what direction you're going to go. That's always the tricky part of it. So water polo is completely new to you. Have you worked with water polo before?
Nope. All my previous institutions I've been at didn't have water polo, so this was my first experience with the sport, but it's been so much fun. I love working with them.
So like when you're actually looking at a new team, a new sport that you haven't necessarily worked with, like I just thought about this and it's kind of interesting because you talk about how differently some of the like interactions with your coaches are. Some are you're a little bit more hands off with how they do things, or you having more player meetings versus maybe more coaches meetings to kind of determine what the direction is going to be for the program and like what you ultimately need to do. When you're kind of learning a new program, is it everybody? You're just talking to the athletes to kind of learn the sport and learn what they need? Are you talking to the coaches more? Are you talking to other people maybe that have been in the sport of water polo a little bit longer?
So a little bit of everything. I definitely meet with the coach first just to figure out how my role can best service his team. What can I do to help you essentially? So I'm trying to figure that out, but I'm also trying to figure out what is the coach's philosophy, what's their style of doing things. So it's one common message that's being communicated to the team. I don't want the coach to be saying one thing or talking about things one way, but then my way is completely different. We have to have somewhere in the middle that we kind of mesh, and it's a similar voice being delivered to the team. So that's the first person I'm going to go talk to. After that, I try to get some feedback from the athletic trainer just to see, hey, like last year, what did you see? What were common things? And luckily, my AT has been with the water polos for a very long time. So she is very familiar with a lot of things that happen on a yearly basis. So she gave me a big rundown of things to look out for or what normally happens, which was extremely helpful. From there, I met with the girls, mainly the captains and the ones that have been with the program for a while, just to talk with them of, hey, previous years, like what did you guys like? What did you not like? What did you want more of? What did you want less of? And then from there, I reached out to other successful water polo coaches in the field. So most of them were up and down the West Coast. So I reached out to Stanford and some of those coaches just to ask them, like, what have you learned throughout the years? What's changed from when you first started with water polo to now? Things of that nature, just to kind of give me a broad scope. Because yes, anyone can look at a needs analysis and demands of a sport, but kind of learning the ins and outs, the personalities, I feel like that stuff is extremely important, and it's not usually in a research article.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, you're not going to see those personalities until you're around them or at practice or kind of see how they take in the weight room. Obviously, like the culture of a team is going to be driven by like what the head coach's values are and like what they're going to get out of it, but there is still kind of an inherent kind of vibe that goes around different types of sports too. Even in different areas too, like you'll kind of get you'll feel it. It's hard to describe in everywhere, but it's definitely a good approach to kind of that you took, like to kind of go from the most inward person, like the head coach is going to be the one driving it. And if that's the message you want, then you can start to kind of build out, because that the last people you should probably talk to is look at, if you're looking at just experts or people that have been in it for a long time, what they're saying might not necessarily apply to your team and your program. So that's a good way to kind of like systematically do it and have those conversations with everybody. But I'm sure like, I mean, the vast amount of teams that you have, like beach volleyball, water polo, tennis, cross country, like it's probably served you really well that you like cross training. You've done so many different like athletic ventures to kind of put you in that position. Is it easier? Is it safe to say it's pretty easier to kind of relate to the athletes and understand a little bit more of their sport since you've kind of touched a little bit of each of them like throughout your own athletic career?
I would say it's definitely easier to understand when they're talking about different things. So if water polo comes in and let's say they had a swim set and they're telling me what their swim set was, I have a basic idea of what it's going to be based off of the yardage they're giving me or the different strokes they do or whatever it may be. Granted, I wasn't going from the middle of the pool and accelerating in one direction. I had a wall to push off of, but I have a basic idea of what they're talking about. And then from research I've done to learn about the sport, when they talk about certain movements they're doing in the pool, I have a basic idea of kind of what they're talking about and I can speak a common language. Cross country is probably the easiest one to relate to, just because I was a runner for such a long time. So when the guys and the girls come in and they tell me about their workout from the morning, I have a basic idea, and they'll ask me what my workout was that day and things like that, because they know that I still run. And then I'm around beach and tennis a lot, just because I've been with them the most since I've been here. So I understand both of their sports pretty well, just because I've been around them for so long.
Yeah, I was gonna say like with cross country and like some of the other sports too that are a little bit different kind of atmosphere. Like you can't really be at their practices necessarily. You can't really kind of be around them in the same manner that you can like when you're with like a team like beach or with tennis where there's kind of like everybody can kind of collectively come to the bleachers or come sit and talk in the locker room where you understand a little bit more of like what's going on. How do you kind of, is it a lot more individual interactions with them, or how do you kind of keep maybe like a team atmosphere with some of those sports that end up being almost like siloed where their own training is important, but at the end of the day, they're kind of getting scored by a team.
So, with cross country specifically, when they do time trials, I try to go out to the track. Usually they're not expecting it. So if I show up out there and they see me, they get really excited, which is cool. Or if they have a race coming up, I'll chat with them whenever they get back from their race, asking how it was. So there's still like that individualized approach you're talking about, but being able to go out to the track for a time trial usually goes a long way because they are running as a team at those. It's not just one person out there. At Florida State, I work with their men's cross country team, and on Fridays was usually when they would either do their really hard track workout or they would do a time trial. So I would pop out there, cheer them on, watch, and then afterwards we would do like a mobility session together. So being able to find opportunities to be present at those kind of more individualized sports. There's ways to do it. You just gotta communicate with the coach a little more and figure out when they're doing things. But water polo is easy because they kind of practice in one little area. So going out to their stuff is pretty easy to get to.
Yeah, with some of that's it's a good way to kind of go out. Obviously, athletes always love
Sorry.
when you're good. Athletes always love when you kind of go out and see like them in their kind of domain. That's their favorite thing. That's where they get to kind of perform. They're not inherently choosing to come in the weight room all the time. Like that's maybe not on the top of their like favorite things to do or why they chose to go to a specific school to play that sport as well. Like some of the sports that you work with might not inherently have maybe that like kind of iron culture or kind of gritty like training atmosphere to it. How do you kind of like work with some of those teams that maybe it's ingrained in the sport where it maybe doesn't seem like it's as high of a priority, or it might come from a coach or different members of the staff that maybe don't see the value as much in training, or do you even have to kind of maybe convince athletes at all that this part of training is important?
Um, so I would say with cross country, that's probably been the one that I've had to do a lot of education and buy-in with over the years, not necessarily at SC. When I first started working with cross country at Florida State, especially my distance guys, because we had distance and mid distance when they would go to outdoor track season. The guys who were primarily more distanced they were just nervous. Like they didn't want to put on body weight. They didn't want to be bulky and all those things. I'm not necessarily the largest individual, but my guys obviously would see me on a daily basis. They knew I trained and they also knew that I ran a lot. So once they found out like how much I lifted, they were like, "Oh, so you can lift weights and not be bulky?" I was like, "Yeah." So that kind of helped with the buy-in a little bit for them. I've seen it a lot with tennis too. So depending on what the athlete is coming from, like if they're coming from juniors, maybe they were a really good juniors player and they just didn't really have to do any extra work to be a good juniors player. Usually those individuals will struggle a little bit in the college sector if they don't buy into the strength and conditioning side of things. And I've seen that at Florida State as well as here. So a lot of that is just educating them, asking them, "Hey, like what are your goals on court?" Okay, my goal is to bend my knees and last longer in rallies. Okay, cool. We might need to work on strength a little bit so we can do that. So just kind of meeting them where they're at and then developing a plan. I think that goes a long way, especially if they feel like you're individualizing it just for them, and you're meeting them where they're at. You're not pushing things into them.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it too, especially someone that's probably a little bit more hesitant or has heard horror stories or just like they kind of sit in that echo chamber of just like, oh, I don't want to get bulky or I don't want to train this way, whatever it is. Like you could take any sport and kind of put something in there that doesn't really necessarily make sense. And they're still going to find some like reasons. Like soccer was like that a lot of times too. Like, and it's the culture has kind of changed, like cross country, like you see it at different places where you need to have that conversation with them, and that's a good approach to kind of take instead of just asking them individually like what in your sport do you want to improve, because they already know there's something that needs to be fixed for them or something that they want to get stronger in or something that's maybe lacking in their performance. and being able to kind of almost like show the proofs in the pudding and give them something almost tailored to that. Like it could be the only thing they do. If it's just, oh, I want to stabilize my knees more, and you just make them do like a ton of quad extensions and like TKEs or something, and that's all they do for like 3 weeks, and they come back and be like, my knees feel better, and be like, all right, let's add another thing to this. Like this is the things that like almost our service and like what we do in here can involve. It's just that slow process with that team. I think it takes a lot longer to kind of like crack into them to actually realize, or unfortunately, it takes like an overuse injury that like sidelines them for a year before they really kind of get the buy-in that the weight room doesn't have to be a scary place and actually help them.
Yeah, I think the hardest thing is definitely you just have to accept that it's going to be a slow process, and just look at it as, okay, well, long term, what do we want? We're not going to get it today. We're not going to get it tomorrow, but just kind of you as the strength coach going into it, knowing that, and then just being okay with taking it slow and meeting the individual where they're at.
Yeah, definitely. That's so I know from your time at Florida State and just kind of balancing all the different things that you had going on, like and organizing just your schedule, like you kind of put yourself in that same situation again at USC. I don't know how, but basically having 5 teams like all over the place and then being pretty involved with beach and then tennis a lot, like you said, and learning a new team and having new coaches and everything too. Like how do you structure your schedule? Like how do you actually like find time for yourself and then for yourself to train and everything too, based off of all these meetings, all these like lifts and training sessions and stuff that are planned because it does when you look at it on paper, you talk about it and you talk about all the things you do, like it doesn't seem sustainable. How do you kind of find that balance within seasons or within the day?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the scheduling aspect. Like if you were to look at my planner, you'd probably think I'm slightly insane. Everything is planned out to like the minute. I have written in there when I'm lifting, when I'm running, when I'm eating, what meetings I'm going to, what location my training session's in, what even training session is going on that day, whether it's day one, recovery lift, whatever it is. Everything is written out, and it's like it's an actual book. Everything's handwritten. So it's all kind of labeled out to a T, and that gets built out on Sunday. It's not like I'm filling it out as I go through the week. No, I sit down and for a solid hour on Sunday, I'm making sure everything is scheduled out to a T of what it needs to be to that week. So when each day comes along, there's no question about it. I know what I'm doing. In terms of training, that's definitely like the hardest thing to find time to do. But for me personally, I know that it needs to be the first thing I do that day. So I'm taken care of. I'm done, and the rest of the day can just be devoted to everybody else. And I can pour all of my energy and time into those around me. And I don't have to worry about saving anything for myself because that's already been taken care of. I'm done. So the rest of the day is just to pour into those around me. And that's kind of how I structure my day. So if that means I'm waking up at 3:30 to train at 5 o'clock, I am, because that's what I did all last fall. I get to sleep a little bit longer this semester. I wake up at 4 and I usually train at like 5 or 5:30, depending on the day. But yeah, I'm usually taking care of my business early on, and then the rest of the day is for other people.
Yeah, that time in the morning, like usually get to yourself. There's not a lot of people up. It's as soon as you kind of get in that habit though, it makes it a little bit easier. And I think you're right too. When you kind of focus on yourself in the beginning, it makes it a lot easier to just put that behind and check that off for the day, and then everything else can kind of be devoted to what you have planned and then your athletes. When you try to like squeeze it in between stuff, like unfortunately happens if you got like a really early team or you have like maybe a double session or something crazy kind of planned from the previous day that leaks into the next day, it's hard to find that time. And unfortunately, sometimes you even like keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it back until you start realizing that like, oh, well, that's the first thing that kind of gets kicked off the schedule because it's not a it's a priority, but it's not your job, like what you're kind of getting paid for it. And you can't tell a head coach or the team that like you're gonna skip their lift because you need your lift. So
Yeah.
prioritizing at least your time and really planning that in place. I know that's helped me too. It sounds like it's helped you as well. Um, when it kind of comes to like what your training goals are looking like, I know you talked about like just kind of setting yourself up for success in the morning before everything else happens. I know your teams have goals and everything. What kind of is your goal when it comes to, if you feel like sharing, like what kind of is your athletic goal now? I know you're doing a little bit of everything, but is there something that kind of you're setting your sights on in the coming months or in the summer, or something competitive that you're kind of working your way towards accomplishing?
Yeah, I usually try to pick some like crazy goal. Like last semester I wanted to get a sub 12-minute 2 mile again. So I ended up PRing, which was pretty cool. I ran faster than I used to run in high school, which was kind of crazy. But now currently I'm training for another half marathon that I'm hoping I can PR at. It'll be right after NCAA's wrap up. So it'll be nice timing because there won't be anything going on, and I'll be able to just go run the race. It'll be down in San Diego. So usually I just pick something that I kind of want to accomplish or do, plan it out, go for it. So recently it's been a lot of running things, but when I was at Florida State, I wanted to be able to do a chin up with half my body weight. So that was a goal for a while. So just kind of different things come along, and I'm like, okay, like I'll train for that. But in terms of my lifting training, usually I'm doing one of my team's programs. I'm not usually doing one of my own programs. When it's running stuff, it's something that I've written up, designed for myself based around my schedule and what I can allot for training each week. And then in terms of lifts, I try to do one of my teams so I know what's being delivered to my athletes.
Yeah, it's kind of a good way to do it. And even though you don't really have like any field sports, like being able to not only do the team lift for one of the teams that you program for, and like doing that program, when you add like your running in there too, it's kind of you get the stress of like what they would endure having practice and everything too. So
Exactly.
it's not like you're doing their training program like in the weight room in a vacuum where you don't really have a lot more of what's going on with them going to practice. And I know it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be exactly the same, but we're not playing those sports at a high of level as them. Like you can't really replicate those conditions unless you're doing exactly what they're doing. And for you to be able to do that many sports is impossible. So that's a good way to do it. So, like with your experience, like in sports science and everything too, like do any of your teams kind of utilize that? Is that something that kind of is also another thing that gets added to your plate, or are you hopefully maybe working with someone in a sports science department or sports science capacity where like at least you can pass that off?
Nope, it's me. We have a football sports science department, and luckily, his name is Jack, but he has a bunch of interns that are very willing to help us all the time, which is super appreciated, and I'm very grateful for that. They're not looking at the data necessarily; they're just helping me run whatever device I need to run if I want to coach. That's been a new thing that we've been able to add on this semester. Previous semesters that was definitely the hardest thing when it came to trying to consistently jump people, or whether it was Nordboard, things like that. I didn't want to be bound to just one part of the room when the session was running. In my mind, coaching the session was more important than trying to get these numbers, and making sure the session was done well was more important to me. So it was a real struggle to try to do that the past couple years, but then luckily this semester we have some extra hands to help us run these tests, which is very nice. And then on the back end, I'm still the one doing all the numbers and putting it all together. But that's okay. For me, the main thing that drives a lot of my training is just velocity-based training. And we have elite form here, which is pretty cool. We didn't have it at any of my other institutions. We just had like tendos and GymAwares. So having the no tether and everything runs off a camera is pretty cool. But a lot of our training is influenced by that on any given basis for each day.
Yeah, that makes it super convenient too, and it probably speeds up sessions as well too with setup and just kind of ease of access, like moving from movement to movement, like within the program as well. But yeah, having a couple extra hands when you actually do want to get some of those numbers and actually maybe sit back after a session and kind of validate whether or not you're moving in the right direction. It's hard. I think you're right too. Like it's hard to justify taking time away from what you should be doing and like coaching and making sure that that is the main focus of what you're doing to just get maybe some other testing numbers or feedback from any sports science device when you have the choice to kind of pick the two. So to kind of rely on some other people and hopefully get a little bit of assistance along the way that like definitely goes a long way and be able to kind of get the information you want, but still make sure that the session is run by ultimately the one person that should be coaching the team when they're in there. So that's a very good point. So kind of going into like your is it going to be second full year at USC now? This is the tail end of the second year? Or
This is third
oh,
year.
this is the third year. Okay. Hey,
Yeah.
so if you're looking back a little bit too, I know getting more comfortable with the teams. I know, like you said, you got a lot of different stuff going on with new head coach for certain teams, and then also like just working with a new sport, but getting more comfortable like just in the atmosphere and like understanding like what college sports entails at like this high level. But if you kind of had advice for yourself or you had to go back and maybe do anything differently that you think if you're being critical, would maybe put you in a better position, a little bit more advantageous position going into your first year. Is there anything you might change or tweak or like have advice for someone that's really starting off year one?
I think the biggest thing I've kind of learned and grown to understand is trust and buy-in is probably one of the two biggest things that you need to be able to be successful in your role. But it's not just formulated in the weight room, it's formulated outside of the weight room. So being able to have great trust and buy-in from your athletes and your coaches, it's going to come from relationships you have with your coaches, your athletic trainers. It kind of goes back to speaking the same language and everyone having the same mindset in the direction that you want to go. So it's not a lot of cooks in the kitchen, it's not a lot of voices being heard. Everyone has the same vision and language that they're speaking in terms of the ultimate end goal. And then regardless of who you're working with, approaching the team as if they're your only team. Obviously, I work with a lot of individuals, but what I'm doing for beach volleyball in terms of what I offer is the same thing I'm going to offer to cross country, water polo, and women's tennis. Everyone is given the same service or access to the same service. I don't pick and choose which sports are going to get a special treatment or extra time because they're a successful program. Everyone's given the same thing. Everyone's offered the same thing. And again, it's just going to go back to those relationships you build that's going to allow you to do your job at a very high level.
Yeah, I know everybody wants to try to give as much as possible to every single team and no team is more important than the one that you're currently working with. It's there are like when you get to some places too, like it's unfortunate, like with NIL and stuff, what's going on, like money kind of drives a lot of sports, and you see it, especially like being on the Olympic side as long as I have been, like I can see like the money follows, like the TV revenue, NIL deals, all that stuff goes there, but you still try to coach every single athlete the same, regardless of like what team they're on. Like do you have like specifically more responsibility or like travel responsibility with like one team or like at any point in time, doesn't matter where you've been like dealt with or seen like some of the like coaches or athletes like kind of get like jealous or ever say like, oh, well, this is your favorite team or this is this. And like, how do you kind of address that? Because it's as strength coaches, we never want to do that. I'm never going to tell one team that they're my favorite. I'm never going to tell like one athlete that my favorite. That like whoever is working with me, whoever is diligent and wants to put in the work and wants to get better and is actually wants it more than I do and is willing for the go out for that help. Like that's my favorite person. I'm not just going to narrowly pick someone else, but have you seen that happen anywhere where you kind of have to like almost explain exactly what you just said right now to maybe a coach or an athlete as well?
I've definitely seen frustration with coaches of, I mean, beach is a good example. I traveled a lot with them last year and there was a lot of east to west travel. So there was a lot of times where I would be gone for a full week and I would have to arrange coverage for women's tennis. And you can definitely see a little bit of frustration from the coaches because your strength coach isn't around. Like I get it. But I think having the constant communication that I have with my coaches. So we have like 3 meetings a week. So we're meeting on a regular basis. I'm being present as much as I can be present. So even though I may have to go away for 4 or 5 days, your team is completely taken care of because everything's been organized weeks in advance. Because you think my schedule is organized, you should see the out of office email I'm sending to whoever is running my team. That thing is organized. So your team is taken care of. I'm being around and being present as much as I'm available to be. And then in terms of the athletes, I've never gotten anything because let's say I get back at 1 a.m. on a Sunday, I'm still showing up at 7 a.m. the next day for my women's tennis team. And they know that. When Beach won the national championship last year, I did not travel back with the team because the charter was full. Charter got back at like 4 p.m. I got back at like 1 a.m. and women's tennis was training in the morning. So I rolled into the weight room, was ready to rock with women's tennis, and they were competing at NC's that weekend. So the gas did not let off. If anything, it was pressed on a little bit more because I still had to bring the energy for that team as they were going into their postseason as well. So my athletes are well aware of the long days, the long hours, but still showing up for them the next day as well.
Yeah, if they hear that and they kind of see the commitment to every single athlete that's kind of under your care, then it's definitely there's no reason to kind of question it. And I think as well organized as you are, and a lot of coaches are when it comes to like trying to service their athletes and service those teams to the best of their abilities, like you have to be on top of your program and you're kind of constantly asking questions. A lot of times, if we don't go out and have those meetings or we don't kind of seek and ask questions, we're the last to kind of know what's going on. So we have to be even more prepared, kind of prepared for everything or prepared for a big switch or a weather delay or a game getting rescheduled. Anything can happen. So being on top of that stuff and kind of preparing whoever's going to be in charge if you're away for a little bit or just kind of having every session detailed and have notes on it, it's only going to help improve and it's going to show again that you actually care about what's going on and everything. So with your teams, do any of them, like I know we talked a little bit like kind of the yoga sessions and other stuff that's kind of like service, like your beach team was doing that as well, like with outside resources and stuff like that. But are any of the teams like you really working on the court, on the sand, like in the water? Is any of that strength conditioning side kind of for you tailor outside of the weight room where you're really involved? Because again, like there's so many different types of training that you'd have to work with. Or at this level, is it a lot kind of just put on the sport coaches to kind of get the most out of it, and then you're in the weight room and you kind of fill in the gaps where need be?
So for cross country, I do not do any conditioning with them. That's kind of taken care of. And then for water polo, same deal. They have conditioning days, and it's swim sets they do in the pool. So the coaches take care of all of that, and that's fairly standard across water polo programs. So for those two sports, I'm only in the weight room with them, but that's kind of all that's needed for them. So I'm running different strength sessions. We'll do circuits sometimes with water polo. We'll do recovery sessions and things like that. But in terms of sports that I'm either on the courts or things like that, I am for women's tennis and beach volleyball. So women's tennis is a good example. Usually on the day before a match, we'll do, our coach likes to call it a movement session. But it's just right at the end of practice. We do some footwork drills, things like that. Kind of like a quick primer to get them just feeling good for the match the next day. And then the day of their match, depending on their setup, we'll do movement stuff in the morning to wake them up if their match is really late in the afternoon. But I'm always around for them because they each need different things based on when they're playing. So the structure for the day looks different for all 10 girls. Um, and then for beach volleyball, I do sand conditioning with them. So I am out on the court for that. And then I'm around at their practices a lot as well, just because my schedule allows it. So I'm able to see what drills they're doing in practice and then the demands that are needed. So I can help implement that, whether it's in our conditioning, in the weight room. We also do a lot of turf conditioning as well. So one of our days we're on the turf the entire day doing change of direction, acceleration, a lot of plyometrics, things like that. So I'll take things on that day as well for them, from what I'm seeing on the court.
Have you found it better sometimes with beach to kind of get them out of the sand and like kind of do their plyo and change of direction? Because I always notice that it's hard to go transition like right to the court just timing wise, or go right from the sand like, and then change and then go right to a turf field if it's even like not booked, just because of like logistics and everything. Have you found like conditioning, change of direction, and like plyo stuff, they've benefited kind of getting out of the sand a little bit, that surface? And then same with tennis too, like just getting off the court, like maybe in a different setting, where you can actually work with them. So it doesn't feel like it's just their sport as much, or they're actually finding a different sort of like outlet and benefit from that.
So with tennis specifically, I actually encouraged my coach to let us do more turf stuff rather than on court stuff because I wanted to put them in a different environment where they had to be more conscious of their movements to make sure they were doing things appropriately. They're used to the tennis courts, they're used to how they feel when they do change direction. My coach didn't want them to slide. So I was like, okay, let's put them on the turf. If they slide on the turf, they're screwed. So they really have to focus on the mechanics and the change of direction. So we do a ton of turf stuff with them. And then once they have mastered the mechanics, then we go back to the court and we do it out there in an environment that they're familiar with. But now they're doing it correctly how the coach wants it done. And then with beach, same kind of thought process. If you're to watch young beach volleyball players in the sand, a lot of times their change of direction is not very good. They like to jump into the turns rather than pulling their body down, decelerating, reaccelerating. And so breaking that down to them, explaining them why the jump is not helping them, it's actually making it harder to change direction. We go over that in our sand conditioning day, but a lot of the stuff that we're doing in terms of mechanics is being done on the turf. Again, to take them out of their normal environment, get them really good at mastering the mechanics in a space they're not used to, and then putting them back into a space where they know how to move and trying to implement the same kind of movement qualities, but in the sand rather than on the turf.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Unfortunately, like the logistics side of it sometimes gets the better of what I'd like to do. But I've seen both cases, like having tennis and seeing them slide. I remember the first time I had tennis, and I think we were testing like their pro agility, but I just modified it to be on the court. And I saw the first kid go up and just slide every turn. And he like asked me the time, and I just looked around and I was like, does that count? I didn't know what to do at that point in time. I was like, this, I guess it does. And I realized in that moment that I almost had to take them away from that to do a legitimate version of any sort of testing to actually make it consistent. And beach has been kind of been the same way too. Like I can't judge based off the lines if they're just digging holes in the sand. So I was like, all right, this makes a lot more sense to actually sit into it. But it's a good practical approach. Definitely like there's times and place, I guess, that you have to use it. Have you found that like you can do this across the board, like throughout the whole season, or there's got to be some sort of at least like indoctrination period for them, or like some sort of like period of time where you're bringing them up to speed on using the turf, or maybe like throttling back? Like, just is that used mostly in the off season, or do you even still kind of use that complementary to get them off of their normal surface during the season?
So for beach, they'll be on the turf year round, throughout the fall and the spring, and we don't really run into any logistical problems because the way that our training is set up, they always come to me before they go to practice, and they have a 30-minute window between when my session ends and when their practice starts. And our weight room is all the way across campus, so they kind of get on their bikes and like caravan over, and then they set the courts up and then they roll. But for us, I almost prefer to have the turf day instead of the sand day year round because they're already in the sand every single day. And I can get a lot more of performance gains off the sand, especially when it comes to increasing verticals. If I'm having them put force into solid ground, it's giving it back to them. If they put force into the sand, it's dissipating. So if I can get their vertical to go up on solid ground, it's only going to be about a 2% decrease when they go to the sand. So if you're jumping really high on the turf, you're going to be jumping high in the sand. It's not going to be quite as high, but you're going to be jumping high. So early on, I introduced turf conditioning before we introduced sand conditioning. And then once we get into season, the sand conditioning goes away, but we keep the turf conditioning throughout the season.
Okay. No, I like that. I think that's a great approach. Obviously, like it kind of works for you guys and it's ultimately been successful. I guess like kind of last one kind of question I have for all that, like going into next year, you already talked about like kind of almost erasing what happened before. Like we're approaching the season. I know by the time this releases, we'll be in the spring season too. So might not see each other until NCAA's. I know we might have actually a matchup when it comes to when the girls are heading over to the West Coast, but other than that, we'll kind of have to leave it at that. But what kind of is the message going into this year? Like, is it completely off the board, not even talking about it at all? Or is it really like, is there still kind of that lingering in the background? It's not talked at all.
I mean, it's touched on, but it's more so of like we know what the process is to get there. So how do we make sure we're doing all the steps to get to where we need to be, essentially? So an easy way to look at it is if someone tells you what their goals are their actions reflecting their goals? So that's kind of the main approach to things, and that's on a year-to-year basis. That's always what it is. If you say your goals are one thing, but your actions are saying another thing, then it opens up the door for conversation. And it's not just a conversation from me; it's a conversation from their teammates. There's a clear understanding of whatever you do does not just impact you. It impacts the 20 other individuals that are trying to accomplish the same goal that you want to accomplish. So that's kind of the message that gets talked about year after year, rather than just kind of talking about the previous success. Yes, that is talked about because it's there, but it's not something that is at the forefront of our minds.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Like the process is a lot more important than anything else that's happening. And ultimately, like competing in pairs and like it's as close as you can get to individual and you're so focused when five courts are going on and you're just focused on what's happening in that moment at your own court. You can't worry about anything else. Like it's still what you do impacts the rest of the team. And that's a great way to put it too. So, hey, for like continuing education or kind of looking at different ideas, like what are some of like maybe your favorite resources or things that like you kind of recommend or even different individuals that like you've leaned on or kind of follow throughout your career that kind of maybe guide you and put you on the right path to kind of be successful?
I think social media obviously is a very good tool. There's a lot of content that gets pumped out on a daily basis. So usually if I see something that interests me, either I reach out to that coach if I want to know more about it, or I'll kind of do my own research on the back end to see what it is that they're putting out on the internet. I'm also involved with the internship program. So I think that's an awesome way to do kind of in-house continued education because you're essentially practicing what you preach. You're telling an intern one day of how to appropriately set up a session or develop an annual plan or do a needs analysis, but then you're reflecting yourself that same given day of, am I even doing what I'm telling these interns that they need to be doing? So I think that's a really cool way to do uh, continued education without having to set up meetings and things like that. I think it's always great to make connections with new coaches, but sometimes we don't have time in the day. So to be able just to do that stuff in house, I think is super beneficial as well.
Yeah, that's a great way to kind of fact check yourself and see when you go through kind of the whole like science side of it, like the textbooks and everything, like is it actually matching up with what you're practically applying, like what you're actually putting on paper? Because a lot of times like it drifts away and that's where like the art and science kind of get kind of that gray area and shrouded. But when you're teaching interns or like we're kind of going over like the nuts and bolts of what makes up a program or how you coach or how you program and things like that, when you're actually putting it on paper or you're presenting it to them or you're asking questions about them, it's the best opportunity to kind of either validate what you're doing or really question if you're like drifting further and further away from what you're telling them that they should be doing.
Exactly.
Hey, so like any good training session, we end the show with a finisher. So I got 4 quarters, 4 questions. And since you like conditioning and running so much, we'll definitely do overtime on the back end. But you can go fast and go rapid fire with each of them, or feel free to kind of fill in the gaps and expand on any. But you ready?
Okay.
All right, first one I got for you. Biggest influence in the strength and conditioning field and favorite athlete in any sport.
Biggest influence was the director at Florida State, Elisa Angeles. She, I just think, is the gold standard of what a director and a strength coach should be. She was so inspiring to be a part of her staff and learn from her. So definitely her for most influential. And then in terms of athletes, I always thought Bethany Hamilton was a super cool athlete. I grew up surfing, and so to see someone who went into the water, went through a traumatic experience, and then still found love in her sport and ways to compete at a high level, I thought was just a super cool thing.
I kind of thought it was going to be a surfer, so I was interested to see kind of who it was, and it kind of fell in line with that. So that's awesome. Hey, when you're not coaching, you're not training, like obviously like there's not a lot of time left in the day, but what are some of your outside hobbies that maybe aren't involved in athleticism?
I'm an artist, so I paint, I design tattoos, I do woodworking, all of the things. But in my free time, I'm usually doing some sort of artwork.
All right. Hey, so I don't know if you've thought about this one. You've had your hand in a lot of coaching, but if you weren't coaching, what do you think you might be doing as a profession right now?
I would want to work with a nonprofit of some sort. So whether it's Wounded Warriors or something in that aspect of helping people just kind of get back to whether it's activity daily living or helping them overcome whatever they need to get back to the lifestyle they want to live.
Okay. Hey, so I know this is probably very different based off if it's a conditioning day or you're in the pool or you're in the weight room lifting. But if you get the choice, what music is kind of in your headphones and what is like your favorite hands down post-training meal of all time?
So if I'm in charge of the aux, it's for sure country music, most likely Toby Keith. It's going to get turned up real loud. And then in terms of food, anything with rice and like some sort of beef and cheese is just like my go-to for like a quick, like I'm gonna down it real quick.
Easy going, yeah, you're on the run, so it might as well make it basically in an easy tube and just make it a tortilla or make it an easy taco. So, hey, last one I got for you for overtime. Like, what is kind of your favorite part of coaching or favorite part of training that kind of got you into it and what sparks you to kind of keep going? Like, what's your hand down favorite thing?
I think my favorite thing is when an athlete recognizes or thanks you for all the little things you've done that might go unnoticed. And if they notice it, I think that's really cool.
Yeah, that's it's that weird recognition. Like I'm definitely not good at all with like kind of taking compliments and like I got my ASUN like championship ring for beach volleyball a couple days ago and like hearing them like comments, I was like, I don't like this at all. And they're just sitting there laughing the whole time. And I was like, it's such a good feeling. I just can't take it very well, but like it's a nice kind of like thing to understand and like hear from others that like what you're doing is kind of impactful, what you're doing is helpful. And I know we don't do it for like the championship rings or like all those things, like we do it for the athletes, but it is nice to like when you go through all the hours, you do all this time like kind of behind the scenes, like in the shadows, like programming and like staying up all night, like really deliberating over like whether you should do this movement over this movement or this many reps over this, and like is it good enough? It's nice to know like at the end of the day, like the athletes like genuinely like do appreciate what you do and like you're putting them in a better position than they would be otherwise. So I couldn't agree more. That it's definitely an awesome feeling. It's even if I can't handle any of the nice things that they say.
I
Hey,
feel you.
so hey, for anybody that's got any follow-up questions for you, kind of want to follow along your either training journey, your coaching journey, try to keep up with your 3:30 a.m. like runs and stuff like that. Where can they get a hold of you? Where can they kind of follow you?
On Instagram, my handle is Madison C. Peele. So that's usually my go-to.
Awesome. Well, Coach, I appreciate you coming on today. Like I said, by the time this releases, we'll be kind of in the middle of beach season. A lot of other sports are still going on for you too. So I know that's not, you've got many more than just that one, but hopefully we'll see each other at NCAA's again this year. And we'll definitely have to keep in touch throughout the process. But I appreciate you coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
That's it for this episode of The Strength Game. Thank you again to this week's guest and to our sponsors. Be sure to connect and keep up with our guests at the links in the description below. Remember to subscribe to us on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast provider to stay up to date on all future episodes. Also, check us out on YouTube and CoachO'Brien.com, where you can find all the video versions of these episodes, as well as show notes, episode schedule, and much more. Comments, ratings, and reviews are always welcome and appreciated. Thanks again for tuning in, and be sure to join us next week for another great episode of The Strength Game.